Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, the Prime Minister dishes up more dough for apprenticeships in a bid to get more young people into skilled work. Victoria to investigate centuries of Indigenous trauma, launching a truth-telling commission on the path to treaty. And despite all the hand-wringing over the appalling treatment of elderly Australians, why aren't we talking more about sexual assaults in aged care? Joining me on the panel tonight, CEO of human resources provider the Adecco Group and MD of technology consultancy Modus Australia, Preeti Bajaj. Welcome to The Drum.
Thank you, Ellen.
Board member of organisations such as Catholic Healthcare and the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse, Rebecca Davies. Lovely to see you in person. Victoria's Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, Justin Muhammad. A busy day. Thanks for making time for us.
Thank you.
And a very warm welcome back to the program in Canberra, advisor to the National Foundation for Australian Women and former senior public servant, Mari Coleman. Hi, Mari.
Hi there.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. We now know that when COVID hit and much of the economy was shuttered, the burden of the downturn wasn't shared equally. For instance, women lost more jobs and took on more unpaid work, and throughout the lockdowns, youth unemployment peaked at more than 16%. And for many, those jobs haven't returned. So in an attempt to stave off the crisis, the government has announced an extension of last year's apprenticeship scheme, which saw businesses receive a 50% wage subsidy for as many as 100,000 new apprentices. Employers will now be given an additional $1.2 billion over the next year.
Today, we're announcing that we're removing the caps on this program. We're extending it out until the end of September of this year, a full 12 months of support for these new apprentices coming on board. So that means anyone who's looking to get into an apprenticeship and anyone who needs an apprentice as they're recovering from the COVID-19 recession, this says that our government is going to carry that with you.
Can I start with you tonight, Justin? So far, this scheme has created a lot of jobs, tens of thousands of jobs in just the 5 months, 7,000 electricians, 6,000 mechanics, 8,000 bricklayers and carpenters. Is that getting across the full range of vulnerable people who might be locked out of employment by this recession?
Yeah, look, I think it's a step towards where we've got to go to, and it's definitely going to help some young people, but there's also going to be young people that will need the step between getting their job as an apprentice and getting that experience and some of that work or knowledge behind them leading up to that, and that's probably the step just before getting the job, which needs to come into place as well, because we know that during COVID a lot of young people found education quite difficult to go through, being in and out of school. So, and then coming into this part now, if they're looking for a job, are they ready for that? And I think there needs to be some additional support to get people ready for the workforce. But definitely a good step forward, which should be embraced, and I'm pretty sure it is. But as long as that we can keep those young people employed and sustain them through the next, once this subsidy runs out, that they continue in employment is very important.
Mari, you were involved in making policy as a senior public servant for many years. What do you think of this policy?
I've just got the tiniest sense that it wasn't run through the Office for Women. I'd be really interested to know how many traineeships for women have already been created. We know that the highly feminised industries like hospitality were severely impacted by COVID, and therefore we know that a lot of women have done worse in terms of jobs than men. I would never oppose more money going into TAFE. But unfortunately the government hasn't been fond of putting money into TAFE. I'd want to know what is being done, if anything, to try to make sure that these apprenticeships do equally, if not better, pick up a lot of the young women who have lost the opportunity to train or to retrain. I think we have to have a gender analysis of how this program works. And I have a lot of reservations about the way a number of states have severely downgraded their actual TAFE training institutions.
Now, Preeti, that's interesting because TAFE is a generation-old model in Australia, a couple of generations old. What do you think about that model of skilling up people? I mean, will it get them the skills of the future, the agility and the workers of the future?
I think that is the strategic question. For long in Australia, we've considered education as an expense, and therefore we are on this continuous fuel of subsidy, whereas we have to move the conversation from education as an investment tool with agility, fast-paced micro-credentialing, and creating new jobs in the new economy of the future. Justin spoke about that the youth has been hard hit. Murray spoke about that the equity and diversity of this subsidy could be put into question. What I'm saying is that we have to not waste a good crisis, Ellen, and really reinvent our education system with agility. Look at models such as General Assembly, where we are a tech education disruptor, and we are working with the Digital Skills Office in New South Wales to create data scientists, 45 of them paid for upfront, because the tax that they will pay in the future as working citizen in high-valued employment and create the economy of the future will offset that initial investment by the government.
So who's doing that's a government investment in data scientists?
It's a federal government investment in the data scientists being run in partnership with Digital Skills Office of New South Wales, Digital Skills Organisation and General Assembly. And that is a rapid agility of innovation and experimentation that we have to do. Frankly, tell me, hasn't the crisis taught us anything? Do we actually have a year to go to university, a year to go through a curriculum? We need to be rapidly moving through the skill sets that we need to transition our career into the skills of the future, which are primarily software and technology. I think the stats are that 6.5 million jobs will need to be filled in the next 5 years in Australia alone across software and other myriad of skills. And it would be a wasted opportunity if we don't use this moment to redesign the system in a diverse and equitable fashion.
And so when you see the statistics that this scheme to date, 50% of the wages paid by the government for apprentices, that most of the new jobs were created in the construction industry, do you have concerns that that's not what we need? We don't need that many tradies.
We need that, but you know what we need more? I'm going to talk about the digital passport of education. We need the ability for that tradie to graduate fast enough with skills so that if he knows how to do plumbing or mechatronics or electrical line schematic diagrams, that he can go to a 3-month course to then work out how to get sensors installed on that diagram and then go become a programmer if he needed to, because actually the transition of construction to technology is a pathway today. Right. There is the thing called smart buildings, and there is a thing called the smart Australia that we must build. It's incumbent upon us post-COVID-19. I think the Prime Minister would agree.
Yeah, that are very powerful points, and I would agree with Justin. I don't have a problem with this scheme in itself, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. So as you were talking, I was thinking, as well as and we'll talk later about aged care, but we need an increased and very skilled aged care workforce. And they are more female than male as a general rule, so where's the money for that?
And the other thing I was looking at today was that Productivity Commission report, and we missed so many things in 2020. We did cover it on the program, but the Productivity Commission found between 2008 and 2018, which was the global financial crisis and the end of the mining boom, Rebecca, that there was just stable wages for people under 34.
Yeah.
So they never really recovered. There was much less full-time work for them as well. And now they're crashing like a wave into this next crisis. So you've got a whole generation of what the economists call scarring and a real desperate need to get across this. And the government's obviously onto that.
Yeah, but if you think about those people as economic units, which is what you're talking about, as taxpayers, as people who are consuming, they're the people that are going to help us through the recovery. If wages stay stagnant, if unemployment stays high, I'm not going to say we're doomed, but it's a big problem.
I think Rebecca has a point, right? Human capital in a knowledge economy is actually the investment asset. And I think we have to rethink our tax system. Should we be giving tax deductions to men and women? for actually investing in education and skills of the future? Will that propel a workforce and, in fact, a creative economy of the future? And we wouldn't be looking at an economy which is strangled with the questions of, you know, do we have stranded assets? Do we have a new industry? And we have to think about what we can learn from the world in this moment. I mean, how is it that we have capital, we have a good, solid educational system, we have competent and amazing, brilliant minds, and yet on the Global Innovation Index, we are way down the rankings, and Switzerland is #1 and United States is #3.
Yeah.
You know, we were an economy which made things, which pivoted to making different things. We do have to do the hard work, roll up our sleeves and do the hard work, Australia, of becoming a knowledge-intensive exporting economy. That's the truth.
Coming up, for years, the sound of gunfire and explosions rang out across the Iraqi city of Mosul. Now musicians have returned, and this week they had an audience with the Pope. The impacts of white colonisation are still being felt every day by Indigenous Australians. We know that many experience worse health outcomes, worse economic outcomes, and find themselves inside the justice system at far higher a rate than the rest of the country. With this in mind, the Victorian Government today announced the creation of a truth-telling commission to expose the ongoing disadvantage and advance the state's treaty process.
This is long overdue. It's an acknowledgement that the pain in our past is present in the lives of people right now. It's a recognition that without truth, without justice, you can't have a treaty. This is something that has been happening around the world. 30 other nations have gone through a Truth and Justice Commission. Canada, South Africa, our near neighbour and friend New Zealand.
The inquiry will be modelled on the one established by Nelson Mandela in post-apartheid South Africa and will be granted the same powers as a royal commission. And co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, Marcus Stewart, says there will be hard conversations ahead.
I suspect we're going to hear stories of the stolen generation. I suspect we're going to hear stories of dispossession. We're going to hear stories about the massacres. We're going to hear stories about Aboriginal deaths in custody and the overrepresentation of our people in the correctional setting, child protection. So we're going to hear a vast range of historical issues, contemporary issues, but then we're going to hear the amazing nature of our culture, the oldest living culture in the world. It'll be testimonies regionally. It won't just be a centralised process. So they will be tasked, the commissioners will be tasked of creating that environment, going out, speaking to community and making sure that what we hear, it actually is impactful and we can use it to create solutions. So we anticipate that the commission, the Yoorrook Justice Commission, will be up and establishing by the middle of this year. We anticipate an interim report 12 months on from there and potentially it running for 3 years. But one thing we're clear on, and this needs to meet our community's aspiration, is this will run as long as it needs to run because these stories, this truth has long been denied. The recommendations will form part of that our finalised treaties, what that looks like. Now, we're still doing a significant amount of work on treaty and the negotiations that are taking place, but truth-telling offers a new mechanism to bring our fellow Victorian along. What we've understood in Victoria is we're not going to wait for the Commonwealth to act on certain things. I want to see change in my lifetime. That's why we're just going about getting things done.
What a landmark day. Justin, what a landmark day. I'll remind the audience that you are Victoria's Commissioner for Aboriginal children and young people, so take as much time as you like. If we hold public hearings in Victoria to establish the scale and the impact of past injustices, and that becomes a permanent part, an unassailable part of the public record, what does that do for the lives of young Indigenous people who you deal with every day?
Yeah, look, this announcement, as it already been mentioned, it is a step forward, step in the right direction. A little bit long and overdue, but very pleased to hear it as an Aboriginal man myself and working in this space for many years. What does it do? There'll be a number of processes here. Obviously, what we just heard from Marcus of getting the structure right, the commissioners on board, getting the conversations taking place across Victoria, and so it's not just centralised but right through regional Victoria and hear as many voices as possible. We've got to make sure we hear all voices, and that includes young people, and often young people, children and young people get left out of the conversation, so pretty sure we've got to make sure that takes place. But the other part of this process, and we've seen before, and I'm not saying put a dampener on it, we've got to be very careful we don't just, you know, say the job's done, we've got this inquiry, it's got Royal Commission powers, there'll be a group of people going around hearing it, writing up the inquiry and then submitting it to the government. But the other very important piece of this is what happens after that inquiry is then submitted and tabled. We've seen Royal Commissions in the past. A lot hasn't changed after the Royal Commission's been done. So we've got to make sure this the powers that has within this inquiry, it's going to make change, as you mentioned, for this next generation. And that's going to be something which we need to really embed as what happens after. And obviously, and during that, a lot of minds are around the table now talking about which we've seen in other countries which have already been mentioned, South Africa, Canada, New Zealand. These processes don't happen overnight. The first time in Australia's history, we're going to get a the full story of colonisation and the impacts that it's had, and not only in the past, and we aren't just talking about the past, but how some of those impacts are still affecting Aboriginal people in today. And we see this in the areas which I work in: child protection, out-of-home care, youth justice, the trauma, the legacy, which unfortunately has stayed with this generation. To see something which might be able to break this cycle, I'm very, very, watching very closely in this space, going to contribute as much as I can to make sure we do get this right. And what it will do for our young people, if they can look back and the rest of Australia, the rest of society where they live in, and especially here in Victoria, say, yep, we've got the full story now, and the full story is not just only of the trauma and the things that have happened against Aboriginal people, but it also, what it unveils when you start looking at the full truth and the full history, is the resilience and the pride and the value that Aboriginal people bring into society. And hopefully, my future grandchildren, my children which are in their early 20s, they can be in a generation where they can be safe, they can be proud, and the rest of society acknowledges that, and it's something which will be able to make our young people and strong enough to reach their aspirations which they are destined for. This is something which I think all of Victorians should be very proud of. But don't expect the magic wand to come over and just resolve everything. It's going to take a process, but the process needs to happen for true healing to take place.
Priti, you grew up in a colonial society. A post-colonial society. Post-colonial society. You'd have to be much older to have grown up in a colonial society. We don't really know our history. This is what this truth-telling is about. How is history taught in India? What do you know?
I think if I think about sort of growing up in India, and I've had the opportunity, as you said, to grow up in India and then 50% of my life in Australia, and the parallel I draw is as follows. The East India Company was formulated in 1642. It's the only corporation in the world that actually ran a country in history, even today. So it's a very interesting fact to know. History teaches you each moment, even about corporate rule. And
Facebook, for example.
Exactly. So it's not new, in other words.
Yes.
So if we notice, if we learn, 1642 to 1947, the British Raj was there in India. And I think what happened for India at the end of once the British left in 1947, 15th of August 1947, I think Jawaharlal Nehru says, as the world sleeps, India rises to freedom. In that moment of freedom, it also made free the storytelling of the journey of becoming free. In 1857, for instance, the first mutiny that was led against the British, the revolt of 1857, was run by a queen called the Queen of Jhansi. A woman.
Yeah.
And she led the army, the alliance, right against the British. And I can tell you, I grew up reading this story. It used to bring tears to my eyes. And also I had a role model. Oh, she was defeated, but she demonstrated courage. And that led to many, many revolutions all the way through to then Gandhi doing the domestic, non-violence marches. And eventually we made SALT to get freedom. I think what really comes down, when I look at our Aboriginal Indigenous Australians, the thing that really hits me is where are the stories? Because those stories are so important for the social healing process. And Hugh Mackay, who's a leading social researcher, he talks about this in Australia, that any historic reconstruction will only happen once we listen, and the stories form the part of pride that Justin spoke about. You know, the pride, the national pride, and the pride in the identity, whether we like it or not, that sense of belonging and community as a whole in Australia, I think it would be awakened. And I think it's something we could draw parallels from. I am a very proud Indian, and I know the ups and downs. It's a two-sided history. We owe it to our Australian students, our youth, our nation, and to our First Peoples that it is a two-sided history.
Yeah, and I'm so relieved that this is happening because I was of the generation where we heard zip. No stories.
Yes, so we
about
just
our
got
Indigenous
1642, 1857, the 15th of August 1947. You know, you can't grow up in India and not know your history. This is obviously in the curriculum. You didn't study history as a postgraduate. This is schoolgirl history. Right?
Indeed. And so it was part of my life. It is part of our makeup. And we need the First People's history to be part of our makeup.
That's right. And when I was at school, we learnt about the kings and queens of England.
Right. Can I go back to Justin and ask you this question? This will have the powers of a royal commission. Now, what does that mean? That means that it'll have the power to compel witnesses. So today, Justin, a New South Wales parliamentary budget estimates hearing, of all things, heard that 2 Indigenous people died in custody last week, but their deaths weren't reported publicly. And the Corrective Services Commissioner, Peter Severin, said, look, we don't publicise deaths in custody. It's not appropriate because it can cause a lot of anger and a lot of angst and a lot of grief. So would you imagine that, for instance, with the case of, for instance, Tanya Day, an Aboriginal woman who died in custody, the Royal Commission might compel people who are police officers to speak about that death, that we might have contemporary deaths in custody conversations in this truth-telling?
Well, I don't want to kind of dig into exactly what it will do, but I do know that when we talk about truth and justice, this is not only the past, when people think past wrongs, that it's, centuries ago. It will be a large part of the stories which have happened many years ago. I'm talking about decades, centuries ago. But also, when we talk about past wrongs, those past wrongs are still happening today. So it would have to look at the topics and incidences that have happened just recently, which have now moved on, but to see how they were they investigated? Were they gone through the right process? Was there a part of this which was done to the level that it should have been given? I mean, hearing some of those views about why the truth isn't being told because of X, Y, or Z.
Anger, angst and grief. Is that any reason not to talk about Aboriginal people dying in custody? Because it might cause anger, angst and grief?
The biggest thing that we've seen here in Australia, and I've heard of others with their education process, and mine wasn't much different. There was very little about Aboriginal Australia before Captain Cook landed here, and the Aboriginal people were viewed in education as a nomadic sort of race. So the history and the truth is something which Australia has really struggled with when it wants to talk about its First Nations people. And when I say the truth of how dynamic and how innovative that we are, but also the truth of the injustices which have happened along the way. And this inquiry with the Royal Commission powers, hopefully it's going to open up, it's going to tell the truth in all detail, so we as a society can actually face up to what has gone wrong, but just as importantly, remember to know for future generations that our future generations, if they see something not going right, they will know for a fact where they need to step up and call it out because they know where our countries come from or this state's come from. And that is places that we've seen and if you read about what's happened in Germany around the Holocaust and how that's educated right through every level of education over there, that when injustices are done in the current time, in modern times, if you've learnt about what your country's done in the past, good, bad or indifferent, but in this case, the injustices, then you'll be able to identify future generations, be able to step in and not make the same mistakes. And this country, can I just say, what we're facing with now, what many of the young people which I work with and the Commission and many others around and the statistics that we see are because these truths haven't been told and we've continued along a process of trying to cover up and moving along like nothing's happened, and we cannot break this cycle. And hopefully a truth-telling, a justice inquiry like this will be able to finally break the cycle to set up a system that can support but can ensure that these wrongs don't happen again in the future.
It's going to be fascinating to watch it unfold and across the whole sweep of history, right up to contemporary times. I think in South Africa they called theirs the Kleenex Commission because there's a lot of grief and there's a lot of tears, and a lot of that has to be gone through in healthy democracies. Former Nationals leader John Anderson is poised to make a political comeback 14 years after retiring from office. The man who served as John Howard's Deputy Prime Minister for a decade wants to return to the Senate. For New South Wales, he'll seek pre-selection for the National Party.
We are living in an area where on a global scale, where there are now 5 or 6 really potentially nasty trouble spots, any of which could erupt and involve the democratic nations in some sort of struggle at some point in the future. And I just think we need to focus on what we can do to come out of the pandemic well and strongly enough, with enough shots in the locker, if I can put it that way, to cope with the next set of challenges, because they will come.
And in a separate radio interview this morning, Mr Anderson offered assurances that he doesn't have ministerial or leadership ambitions, but it's clear that he sees problems with the current political discourse.
We've got to break down the poison of identity politics and get back to vigorous debates. The American thinker David Brooks says we're combining anger with disgust for others, and then that turns into contempt. And when you reach the point of contempt, the ability to find the compromises, to identify the common interests, that can't be taken for granted. And I think part of what I'm saying is that the National Party is a natural repository of a more pragmatic and sensible approach that says Jack's as good as his mate. We might disagree with him, but we're going to make this work together.
Now, let's start with you, Mari. John Anderson's 64 years old, so we don't want any ageism here.
No, I mean, really, he's quite a lad, young lad, as far as I'm concerned.
Should he have another go around?
No. Look, I have occasion to bump into from time to time some really quite outstanding younger women, younger than Mr Anderson, who are rural women. I'll be off on Sunday, I hope, to a short meeting with a number of women rural women coming from all over Australia to the meeting of, I think they call it a muster, of the Rural Women's Alliance. Look, there will be no end there, and even though among those not attending, of outstanding rural women who should be among the people that the National Party is looking to bring into politics. The National Party really needs to pay far more attention to its rural women. And I think recycling somebody as amiable as Mr Anderson may be one thing, but there's a terrible look of a decaying, out-of-touch entity. And that's not where rural women are now. I just think it would be a terrible mistake, a really bad look for the Nationals to think in terms of re-endorsing somebody from the Howard ministry rather than looking for somebody who is an up-and-coming rural woman from whatever state and from whatever rural industry or rural sector they're involved with. Their alternative, of course, is that a number of those rural women are going to finish up as independent candidates.
Just quickly, Justin, who would be your ideal National Party senator for New South Wales? Who would be your ideal candidate? Who would you point to?
Look, I wouldn't point to anyone in particular. I agree with the previous comments. I mean, look, what I would see is that it is time for politics to start reflecting the society we live in. And if you look at any of the in Canberra and most areas of Parliament, it's still very male. It's very white, and I think we need more. I mean, there was a report just recently about the coalition and about the lack of women within the coalition, and now they want to bring up someone who's been there before, who will probably, sadly, will probably get it if he does run. We've got to change this around, and I agree with the comments before. Women have got to be tapped on the shoulder to say, yep, here's an opportunity, but also to get some diversity within our politics. And that's where I think the biggest problem we've got is there's not enough diversity, not enough difference with gender. And we're basically, if we're coming to this point, what other form of politicians are going to put their hand up to come back in? And that's, I think it's time for change.
What about his point, Rebecca, on compromise? Obviously, there are factions within the National Party, and perhaps part of his resurgence might be to calm some of that factionalism. And while some in the National Party want to get action on climate change, there is a rump that's effectively blocked it, refused to compromise. Just in March, we saw Industrial Relations Minister Christian Porter last March and ACTU Secretary Sally McManus compromising wonderfully at the beginning of the pandemic, and yet it all fell apart with the industrial relations reform. Has he got a point on compromise?
Well, I don't think compromise ability is only in the hands of someone who's been around for a long time. I guess my point is the same as the ones that both Justin and Mari have said. This is a precious slot. Getting an electable position on a Senate ticket is a precious thing. And I'm not saying that that he might be a great guy with lots of good ideas, but it's somebody else's go.
Well, Pope Francis has become the first pope to visit Iraq 2 years after Islamic State was defeated in the country. The northern city of Mosul, once an IS stronghold, was among the Pope's destinations in the ruins of a former church. The pontiff gave a service and released a dove for the victims of ISIS's 5-year reign of terror. Music from Mosul's youth orchestra accompanied the Mass. Formed just 6 months ago, the orchestra was unable to play under Islamic State when most music was outlawed, and last week they launched themselves onto the world with this stunning performance. You're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, CEO of the Adecco Group and MD of Modus Australia, Preeti Bajaj, Non-Executive Director Rebecca Davies, in Melbourne, Victoria's Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, Justin Mohammed, and in Canberra tonight, Advisor to the National Foundation for Australian Women, Mari Coleman. When the landmark Aged Care Royal Commission finally reported last week, there was a collective gasp among much of the industry. It shined a light on ill-equipped providers, a perpetual lack of training, and an almost universal feeling that things could not go on as they have been. What was almost absent, though, were recommendations specifically related to sexual assaults in aged care. We know this is an endemic issue. 2,520 sexual assaults occurred in residential nursing homes in 2018-19. That's almost 50 a week. Margarita was in her 90s when she was sexually assaulted in her aged care home. In 2018, she became the first older woman in Australia to publicly share her story in this video. The Drum's Eliza Harvey has more.
For I have loved thee very long, delighting in your company.
Beautiful.
Very slow.
Margarita Solis was a retired nurse who moved into her aged care home at 90. 4 years later, she was sexually abused by the manager of the home.
It's just as though because you're old, you're not worth anything. And you're just young people in an old body. You're no different, not till you look in the mirror.
Margarita kept the abuse secret because she feared people would blame her. She finally told a trusted staffer at a nearby activity centre who helped her report it to police.
I never thought it would impact me the way it did. You know, I've had much worse in my life, really, and I just couldn't talk myself out of it. I'd try and be logical and say to myself, come on, you know, he wouldn't dare come back here. But at the same time, if I heard a footfall outside, that was sleep gone for the night. In fact, I slept with the lights on, really, for over a year.
In the wake of the Aged Care Royal Commission, providers will be compelled to publicly declare that incidents like this have occurred. However, the seriousness of the incident will be decided by staff on the back of the perceived impact of the abuse. For Margarita, that impact was clear. She withdrew, stopped eating and dropped nearly 20 kilos before reporting her abuse.
I found the sexual assault people very helpful, very kind, and they helped me to vent my anger against him, which was a release because I was very angry. Because I felt that people like that think that you're nothing. They can do what they like and you can't do anything about it. And if you speak up, then you are doing something about it.
Wonderful, brave testimony. For more on this, we're joined in Melbourne by founder and director of Celebrate Ageing, a program challenging ageism and preventing elder abuse, Catherine Barrett. Hi, Catherine. You worked with Margarita to produce that film, which, as we said, the first time an elderly woman had spoken about sexual assault. It remains extraordinary. What is the legacy of her bravery in speaking out like that?
I think what Margarita has done is created a real visibility, not only around the problem of sexual assault, but also too around the silencing. So Margarita's sexual assault occurred in a seniors rental service, and everybody that she told, up until she spoke to the worker in the seniors activities service, you know, she was dismissed and she was discredited. And it really took a lot of courage on her part to continue through the process of reporting. And so there's a really important legacy that not only has Margarita raised visibility on the topic, but also too on the impacts that it has on older women. Margarita talked about losing weight, not being able to sleep, and she also spoke about losing faith in humanity and that she didn't know who she could trust anymore. And I think that's incredibly important because we know that the recent KPMG research on that looked at staff working in residential aged care, 58% of the staff said that sexual assault or rape had no negative impacts on the victim. So that's a really stark contrast with Margarita's message that she was devastated actually, and it wasn't until she found people who were willing to listen to her, that she started to learn to trust again, she started to sleep again, and she started to regain weight. So this is devastating. And we know that in the broader community, 94% of people who are sexually assaulted suffer PTSD. Why would we think that it wouldn't have a negative impact on older people? I mean, that's surely ageism and sexism.
And we think about who is vulnerable to sexual assault. You know, we're conscious that the ages from 15 to 19 are very vulnerable times in a woman's life. But if we read that there are 50 assaults a week, and we imagine that perhaps that's the tip of the iceberg, that would suggest that women are equally vulnerable at the other end of their lives. I mean, you're an expert in this field. Is that true?
Yeah, look, they are. I'm not sure about equally, but incredibly vulnerable. And there are some unique factors. And having a diagnosis of dementia is one of the factors. We know that in residential aged care that it is women with dementia who are more likely to either be targeted by perpetrators who think or know they can get away with it because an older woman either won't be able to report or won't be believed. And the other factor as well too, that an older woman can't call out. An older woman with dementia may not be able to call out for help. So this is a particular issue for older women with dementia. But I think that if we look at the factors that make older people and older women in particular vulnerable to sexual assault, it's ageism. It's our not wanting to hear that
a 95-year-old woman would be raped, presumably on the basis that you imagine it to be a crime of passion rather than a crime of power, and therefore how could she possibly be vulnerable? Is that the idea?
Yep. And the myth that sexual assault is about sexual attraction and older women aren't sexually attractive, so therefore they won't be. And if there is an older person's equivalent to dismissing an allegation of sexual assault, if in young women it is what was she wearing, what was she doing out at night, with older women, we find time and time again she must have a urinary tract infection. So this total dismissal of...
So this is not the result of a rape or unwanted sexual contact. She's just got a UTI some other way.
Yes, and I was contacted recently by a family. Their mother had reported a rape in a residential aged care home, and she was sedated. And they had terrible trouble managing her sedation because as much sedation as they could add in, she kept saying that she was being raped and was becoming more and more agitated. And people weren't looking at the possibility that she was saying that she had been raped because she had been raped.
Right. Murray, can I turn to you? I mean, you have worked in this area from a policy perspective under the Hawke government, under the Whitlam government and in the years preceding the Whitlam government. But I want to talk to you about your own experience, about when your mother was in residential setting. And you were fearful about this then.
Well, yes. I mean, this is back in the 90s. My mother was in the higher care area. She didn't have dementia, but she was very frail, and she was towards the end of her life. She kept on, every couple of weeks she'd be taken off to hospital and then they'd stabilise her and so forth. And she was in great terror because there were ambulatory patients, male patients from the dementia ward, wandering past her door and often coming in. And she was genuinely terrified of what she could do to try to prevent being abused. Now, I'm not saying she was, but it was a really genuine fear for her. And I think, you know, it probably reflected that sense that who was going to believe a woman in her late 80s? Where were the staff who were trained to properly manage people with dementia who were capable of wandering around? It was among the very worrying things about her last months.
Yeah. Well, from next month, the government is introducing a serious incident reporting scheme, compelling aged care providers to report incidents like neglect, unreasonable use of force and unexpected deaths. Then from October, they'll be required to report all incidents of resident-on-resident sexual assault, the first time that's ever been a requirement. But how seriously a case of sexual assault is dealt with, what priority it's given by the authorities, will depend on how staff perceive the physical or psychological impact on the victim. And advocates like Catherine say the idea that such an incident wouldn't impact an older woman, including some with memory loss or dementia, is astounding and contrary to everything we know about sex abuse victims, regardless of their age. Well, Catherine, the Royal Commission pinned its hopes on this scheme, the Serious Incident Response Team, not reporting scheme, response scheme. Why would the cornerstone of it be trying to prioritise incidents of unwanted sexual contact? I mean, why would you need to give them a priority? Where's that come from?
Well, I think part of where it's coming from is, you know, concerns about the burden to staff who are working in residential aged care. But I think what we've got to do is take a couple of steps back and look, as the Royal Commission did, and look at residential aged care and say, well, what is happening that we're saying that in the reporting that we're not looking seriously enough at sexual assault, because that could be a burden to staff. There's something incredibly wrong here. This has to be taken seriously, and by taken seriously, it must not only be reported. Every incident of sexual assault must be reported, but the reporting can't be done for any other purpose other than to do something about that. You know, we must be looking at that data and saying, well, what's happening here, and what resources do residential aged care service providers need to stop this from happening? That must be the purpose for collecting the data. It has to be.
And Rebecca,
Can I?
Yes, go,
Sorry.
Mara, you speak.
I was just going to say we've had a terrible week, or terrible more than a week, of reports, public discussion of allegations of sexual attacks, some of an historic nature, some of them much more recent. One of the things that has produced has been an amazing outpouring, particularly on social media, of women who have never before disclosed reporting episodes of sexual abuse in their lifetimes. And I think that what is happening here in aged care is, in a sense, absolutely no different from what is happening in the rest of society. There is, regrettably, an unwillingness to take women seriously. I mean, I have been appalled, I think I can't more strongly stated, to have 2019 images of the Prime Minister saying women must be believed, and then when an allegation arrives, he says, the person in question has denied it and I accept it. Now, we have a dilemma in modern society about willingness to accept that women of all ages are subject to unwanted sexual advantages. They must be believed and action must be taken to deal with the consequences for the people who are responsible.
And we emphasise again, Christian Porter has strongly denied those allegations. Now, Rebecca, you sit on a board that oversees residential aged care, quite a large residential aged care service. So under this scheme, the definition of whether something needs to be reported is whether staff judge that the incidents have caused physical or psychological injury or discomfort that requires medical or psychological treatment. Do you think that's sufficient, given what we're talking about is unwanted sexual contact?
Yeah, well, I guess...
or inappropriate sexual conduct, they're the two.
In our organisation, we would take our own rules about these things, about what needs to be reported, whether it's to police or internally, and what action has to be taken.
And are you comfortable that your staff get to decide that, when we know from that KPMG report that Catherine referred to, that 58% of staff thought that if the victim had a cognitive impairment, she may not have any physical or psychological impact from such unwanted contact.
And obviously that's a very great concern. And all of this means that there needs to be continuing and constant reinforcement of the cultural values, which are elderly people are to be respected just the same as anybody else. If an elderly person complains about something, that has to be taken seriously. But staff are also there as, or should be, there as advocates for the people they're caring for, because if the older person has dementia or some other condition which makes it hard for them to report, then the staff have to be there to do it for them. And as an organisation, we have to empower them to be able to do that, to celebrate people who actually become advocates for the people they're caring for, and to take action.
Catherine, can I just underline, though, that from April till October is what you're saying to me, that even a rape in aged care might only be prioritised if, and I don't want to disparage aged care workers, but if untrained or semi-trained, low-paid, overworked staff make a judgment that perhaps a cognitively impaired resident was actually injured by that rape. They're the only circumstances in which that would be reported. Is that right, or be required to be reported?
Alan, it's actually all residents, so not just residents who are cognitively impaired.
Right.
Yeah, so the assessment is on staff working in the aged care home, and the comments from the previous speaker about that beautiful approach in the best of residential aged care homes, which is advocacy and genuine caring and really, really listening. We know that can happen, but the Royal Commission is telling us that it doesn't always happen. And the KPMG report is showing some real red flag signs of concern. And what I understand from the Serious Incident Response Scheme is that we are, in the first instance, is reporting incidents where staff are seeing an adverse impact on the resident, and you know, if we extrapolate across the KPMG findings, that if staff aren't seeing sexual assault as having negative impacts, and that includes rape, they're not seeing it as having a negative impact, we've got a real problem. Because I think we are not educating sufficiently, empowering the workforce to understand the kinds of things, the community expectations. The community expectation, this is taken seriously. Older people have the right to be safe in residential aged care, deserve respect, and we have to educate and empower the workforce so they understand their responsibilities and that they know what to do.
And rape is a crime. And rape is a crime, and you are required to report crimes to the police. So
currently, would you?
Yeah, absolutely.
In your
and but if I could interrupt, there was ABC reported on a story in Rockhampton 2 weeks ago, and there was a 5-year delay, and that was a rape by a staff member. Of a resident. It was witnessed by another staff member who reported it, was silenced by management, and it took 5 years for that staff member to step up again. So, you know, we have inconsistencies.
Yes,
we have good practice,
yep.
and we have inconsistencies.
Okay, and we will move on, but to a related topic. But I will note that recommendation 100 from the Royal Commissions talked about this serious incident scheme, and it suggested that the quality regulator publish the number of serious incident reports at a service level. So that's a very important thing for consumers to be aware of and elders to be aware of, that recommendation is sitting there, and we will be watching very carefully to see whether it's implemented. Now listen to this. When COVID hit, Vicky Raj had been showing signs of dementia and was receiving assistance from allied health services, but as the pandemic unfolded, much of that help disappeared. She became isolated, and her daughter Malini Raj moved back into the family home to look after her. Over the following months, Malini watched her mother's health rapidly deteriorate. She spoke to the Drum's Eliza Harvey.
I said,
Malini Raj moved in with her mother when the pandemic hit.
At night time she would wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and she just would not go back to sleep. And
was she distressed?
Yeah, she was distressed. She didn't even know that where she was, her house was her house. Like, she'd gotten to the point where she was in familiar surroundings that she'd been in for 25 years. Routine's really important for dementia patients. As soon as that was thrown out of whack, she really struggled because she used to know that Mondays she had to get up, like someone would pick her up. When Monday came around and no one came and picked her up, she struggled with that.
Malini watched her mother's health decline rapidly. She stopped recognising Malini and would leave the house and become disoriented. It was no longer possible for Malini to care for her mum alone.
That was hard firstly for when I first put her in and I could only go half an hour a day, wear masks, stay in a certain place.
She wouldn't have understood?
No, she wouldn't have understood, and then she was like, no, please don't go, and I was like, have to go. To add to the fact she's only 69, so she's so young, so she's also the youngest in that facility, and everyone, even the care workers get distressed because they see her potentially as their mum, and so they've been quite teary at times, and everyone just looks at her going, it's just such a waste.
Yeah, really hard decisions. Thanks for talking to us, Malini. You were looking at that just then, Preeti, and saying there's cultural elements to that, as well as all these stories about what's happening in aged care. She would be having thoughts about what the expectations of her as a daughter are.
Indeed, I mean, I actually personally know Malini as well. So, right there is the societal fabric of going back and caring for your parent playing out, and she's back in there with her mother. I mean, it made me think back to my mum, who's during COVID has been in India all along. There's no way I can get there. That's a whole host of different issues to talk about. But, it also made me reflect on when we're designing a system, we always think about a couple of principles, and we think about, is there equity in the system? We think about, are we applying human-centered principles to design? We talk about this and forgive me to bring this up, but we talk about this in technology a lot. I feel like we can lean here on that principle and go back to aged care and say, are the human-centered design principles being applied?
Is the human at
the center of this design, and the human being all humans, men and women?
A final comment from Justin. We're nearly out of time. You deal with vulnerable people all the time. Your reflections on this, a difficult decision, but I must say, Malini's mum's getting great care now, but a difficult decision.
Yeah, I mean, over the last, that story and the one before, we're talking about vulnerable people, if it's children and young people or our elderly, and it's how they are valued by society, and very difficult. We need to have the services there to support them, and our elderly, I mean, again, the value which they have contributed to their families and to society, is it being recognised? And what we've seen is that the care that is being played out sometimes isn't up to the level that it needs to. And I understand the funding's very difficult, and there needs to be further investment. But on a cultural element as well, completely understand in the Aboriginal community, the elders are very important, and it's hard to balance that. So
we're
something which we have to be better at.
Yeah, we're out of time, but I will say, Justin, recommendation 48 is to undertake regular cultural safety training. If you've been affected by anything you've been seeing, call Lifeline 13 11 14, 1800 737 732 as Respect. Thanks for your company tonight. Good night.